Welcome, everyone, to our live webcast, Managing the Human Side of Digital Procurement Transformation. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mike. I'll be the operator for our presentation today. Now, before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acquaint you with a few features of this web event technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume settings that you may have. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see the text chat window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the bottom where you can type in your questions. To send a question, click in the text box and type your text. And when you're finished, click the send button. All questions that you submit are only seen by our presenter today, and your questions will be responded to in the order in which they were received, will be addressed near the end of our presentation today. We are joined today by our speaker, John W. Hansen, writer and speaker at Procurement Insights. As the editor and lead writer for the Procurement Insights blog, John Hansen has written nearly 3,000 articles and papers, as well as 5 books on subjects as diverse as supply chain practice, public sector policy, emerging business trends, and social media. With that, John, I'd like to welcome you to the program today, sir, and this audience is all yours.
Well, Mike, listen, as always, it's a pleasure to share these virtual airwaves with you, and I'd like to welcome everybody joining us. A couple of quick things before we get into today's session, which I promise you is going to be very fast-paced, interesting, and hopefully insightful. A little bit about Zycus, comprehensive source-to-pay suite. As you can see on the wheel there, it gives you a good deal of an overview or understanding of what Zycus provides, and I would encourage you at the end of the session, when you click off and say goodbye to us, to spend some time on the landing page that they have set up for you because, again, it'll give you some great insights in terms of what the organization is about and what they do. Now, I want to get a few housekeeping chores out of the way. To begin, tweet chats. Digital People is the hashtag, and what we do following all of these webinars on Twitter is we have over the next 24 hours what we call, of course, a tweet chat. And if you put in the hashtag Digital People, you'll be able to join myself as well as other industry thought leaders and people from the industry who may not be in this particular webinar, but certainly have a lot to say about the digital transformation that is reshaping or shaping our industry. So just remember that and join us again anytime over the next 24-hour window. Share your thoughts, share your ideas in terms of what you heard, and certainly feel free to ask questions. And Mike, this leads into the next thing. This is going to be very much an interactive experience. Now, I know a lot of webinars, you'll wait until the end to ask your questions. Well, I would encourage you throughout this entire webinar at any time throughout, use the question or the chat room to post your questions and ask questions because Mike and I will do an active exchange and have an active dialogue with you, and we want to make sure that you're part of the process of discussion here. We're not going to be talking at you. We want to be talking with you. I guess that's the best way to put it, right, Mike?
I think that describes it very well, John.
And so if we look at the objectives of today, there are 3 primary ones. What is the real landscape when we talk about digital transformation? And that may seem like a misnomer or a strange kind of question to ask, but you're going to find as we progress through here that digital transformation is far more than technology. And I'll get into the subject of having to look beyond the technology to see and embrace your corporate culture to see if you're digital transformation or digital ready. We're going to talk about, is your career digital ready? Are you lined up to be able to move into this? And there's some very interesting statistics and numbers that may surprise you in terms of your overall readiness. And when we talk about readiness, we're not only talking from the standpoint of an organizational perspective, we're talking about from an individual procurement professional standpoint. And finally, your next move. With all this information that you get, and I enjoy talking about this subject. I enjoy talking about anything. I mean, Mike, you can attest to the fact that I'd probably go on 2 hours if there wasn't a hard stop, right?
You have a lot of information to share, John, that's for sure.
But the key is our job here is to provide you not only with information and ideas and thoughts, but provide you with practical things that you can do. So when you go back to the office tomorrow, you'll be able to say, here is how I can take that information and apply it in a very practical way in what I do individually. And that's the whole objective of all of these things. So that's the focus of today's agenda. Now, going on to the next slide, here we got, do you see the forest or the trees? There's that old saying, can't see the forest for the trees. Well, when it comes to digital transformation, It seems to be an either-or proposition. Very few people look beyond the technology, and that's the one thing that I want to start taking away or start having you think about today is what is beyond the technology of digital transformation. Yes, technology is very, very important, but as you'll find out as we get into today's discussion, it is an extension of people. People aren't an extension, or you're not an extension of the technology. The technology is an extension of you. And I want you to start shaping your mindset around that as we enter our first poll. And I forgot to tell you, we actually have polls, so we want to hear what you have to say. And with this first one, Mike, we're going to ask the question, which of these areas are most important to CPOs? And the reason we're saying CPOs and referencing these studies is quite simply this. We're in the procurement world, and thus CPOs have a great deal of influence in terms of what we should be striving to achieve, what we should bring to the table when we talk about working in a digitally driven procurement practice. So you have a couple of choices here. You have value and collaboration, you have talent, digital procurement, of course, and other. And, of course, you could say no vote, but, I mean, I don't know why anyone wouldn't vote. Do you, Mike?
I really don't, John. I think they should participate and make their voices heard.
And there are fantastic door prizes at the end of the show. No, I'm just kidding. There are no right answers here, by the way. I want to encourage that. Now, you know, it's kind of interesting as we look at the numbers here. Right off the bat, it seems to be heavily weighed towards value and collaboration. So I'm going to ask you out there right now, in terms of questions from the audience, why do you think value and collaboration is so important? Why did you pick that? If you could, please share that with us now, and I'd like to get your feedback on that and get an idea as to what your thinking is on that, why you chose that. And is that, in your mind, the most important consideration when it comes to a digital transformation? Because it does seem, Mike, that value and collaboration are important, but is it really involved with anything digital? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think it is, John, and I'll just remind everyone, too, to make a comment about, the why on value and collaboration. Just use that Q&A window located just the right-hand side of your slide screen, and go ahead and please give us some feedback as to why you picked the answer that you did through our first interactive polling question.
All right. So how much time do we have left on this particular poll?
And, John, I think with that, we've pretty much, most of the sites have already made their selections, so you're kind of looking at the final results, sir.
Perfect. Well, you know what? I don't know about you, but I'm a little bit surprised. Certainly value and collaboration. That's why I want your feedback on this, because usually there is a much more balanced, I guess you would say, perspective on what's important. And I'm not underestimating the importance of value and collaboration, but let's look at this. People have to be able to make systems work. Kathy is saying that make systems work and work with other departments well. So, I mean, Kathy, when you talk about that, you're really saying is no matter how good the technology is, and please respond, it doesn't matter how good or how advanced technology is, it's not really relevant if you don't have the people factor in there. I would take it that that's what you're saying, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on that. Najla said value and collaboration. Stephen said, by collaboration, you can utilize the talents and knowledge of multiple people to add value. Interesting. Laura Hunt said, digital procurement adds to value. If done right, has this talent. CPO needs to focus on value to other leadership team. Now, you see, this is all an interesting trend here because, Mike, this seems like people are really embracing the side of the human aspect of digital transformation and digital procurement. I mean, that's what this would indicate to me. What do you think?
It seems to be pointing in that direction, John, that the human interaction is important.
Now, I'm going to read a few more comments here, and then I would like somebody to comment on why they chose talent as being important, because only 7.23% of the audience said talent is important, and just 2%, just under 2.5% said digital procurement. Now, let's see, Laura said, just on the ones who are in the 93%, digital procurement really is part of the value factor. Absent value delivered, says Gregory, we have no jobs. Value cannot be driven in a vacuum. Now, Gregory, that's an interesting point. We have no jobs. That's interesting. I want you to all remember that because we're going to come to a point where we're going to discuss all these things. But is it safe to say the general representation here, and again, I'll encourage anyone who voted for talent or digital procurement, and don't worry, no one else is going to look upon you for voting out of the majority in any bad way. But why did you particularly choose talent, and why did you choose digital procurement? But I think the general consensus here is that if you don't have value and collaboration, which are human traits, it doesn't matter how good the technology technology is. Well, it's an interesting thought there. I'm going to move to the next slide. It's an interesting thought here because in the last 2 weeks I've talked with a couple of people, and I'll get into the value and collaboration element in a moment. But I talked to the head of Lenovo, and you've heard of Lenovo, Mike. I mean, they're originally the IBM PC side that was purchased by that company back in 2005. And I was talking with the head of Lenovo, and he said something interesting. He said, when it comes to digital transformation, you have to look beyond the technology and embrace the culture of your organization. In other words, your culture has to be ready. Your organizational culture has to be ready to leverage technology. If it isn't ready, no matter how great the technology is, you are not going to achieve the desired outcome. Now, that's an interesting consideration. And so it goes not only asking the question, is your organization digitally ready, but here's another interesting fact. And I was talking about a month ago with the new head of Microsoft Canada, President Kevin Peasker, and he was talking about the fact, and this is going to the jobs factor, is he said that in most instances, and this is Canadian statistics, but it seems to be consistent across the board, there is only 54% of all the jobs necessary in this new digital economy are being filled. And that gap is growing. In other words, there's not enough talented people, not enough capability to meet the requirements to actually leverage digital technology. Now, did that surprise you, Mike?
No, I think, John, I would almost think they would go hand in hand with the talented people being able to utilize emerging technology and ever-changing technology.
Well, and you know what? And now here's going back to the poll results, which is interesting. 90% here said that it's value and collaboration. Jason said value and collaboration are the easiest to quantify. What value has procurement brought to the company? We're going to look at that in a moment, Jason, and I want you to follow on that. And Don indicated if people collaborate, it'll bring value. Again, all of this makes sense, but believe it or not, all three of these areas are extremely important, where one doesn't have precedence over the other. Now, I'm not minimizing what you said because it's very important in the voting. I mean, Mike, I'm glad I'm not running for office here because I would be out of a job. But in reality, all three of these areas that we posted there are important. I'll go through each of those right now. And I highlighted the key things. Business partnering is strong. There is a consistent gap and a lack of leadership when it comes to creating proper business partnering. And so when CPOs look at these things, they talk about the fact that, look, we have to be able to learn to collaborate better, both internally as well as externally. So, that's really verifying what our audience is saying today. However, and this is an interesting point, talent. The skills of the past will not deliver the needs of the future. So I'm going to ask a question right now, and we're going to cover this a little bit later on. How many of you out there believe that you're digitally ready? How many of you believe you possess the necessary skills right now to deliver the needs of the future, leveraging new technologies, leveraging new methodologies and way of working? And by the way, this is referring to a recent survey. So we're not even dealing with an old survey. We're dealing with one from May, June of 2017. And CPOs are indicating that they don't believe the skills are there. Now, James, you came on and said you do. So, first one here, I'm going to have to ask you, why do you believe you possess those skills? I'm going to pose that question to you, James, and I hope you respond because I'd like to know, because this will help everyone get an idea as to whether or not they do. And, of course, this question wasn't just directed at James. I mean, everyone else out there who's in the audience, why do you believe, or why don't you believe, you have the necessary skills to meet the future needs of organizations when the majority of procurement CPOs believe that there is a talent gap and that most of the skills from the past really deliver the needs of the future? So anyway, now, James, you came back and said, I do as a person extensive research on EPR system, implementation, e-procurement, and invoice automation. Interesting response. So what you're saying, James, is you're proactive in terms of learning the technology. But let me ask you this. Are ERP systems, implementations, e-procurement, invoice automation, are these all part of a digital transformation strategy? Now, Kathy said a lack of investment in technology and people training. I want you to remember that because, Kathy, that's a very interesting point because in this side, they're talking about the skills of the past will not deliver the needs of the future. But, Mike, if you don't invest in training and educating people to be able to provide the new or bring the new skills to the table, I mean, how can you really expect them to deliver results, right?
Well, they wouldn't have the ability or the tools to be able to continue to advance and help the company advance.
Absolutely. So if we look at this, and I may have skipped an extra slider. Nope. So if we look at this, and Mike, that's a very good point. Value and collaboration, talent, and digital procurement are, again, all equal importance to CPOs. And it's like juggling three different balls. Which ones has the most meaning? Now, wait. Susan said the company is not using the ERP system to the fullest potential. Therefore, the people are not trained. So that's interesting. So the training isn't there is what you're really saying, Susan. And, of course, James is talking about the fact that it's very difficult to get executive-level support on changes due to a lack of awareness. But here's the thing, James. If you can't get executive-level buy-in or change, then what are we talking about in terms of digital transformation? How are we going to be equipped to be able to handle that? Now, again, the whole focus of this is it's not just in terms of digital, and I'm glad you've caught on to this concept very early in this discussion. Digital transformation, yes, it does involve technology, but technology is really an extension of the overall movement of digital transformation. It is the people and the culture within the organization that drive it. Now, you think about it, the CPO's priorities going in, what are their priorities? And I want you to remember some of these answers that you've given so far as we go to our second poll. According to studies, which of the following areas are most important to CPOs to address? Now, remember, we talked about what is the most important areas. What are the most important areas here in terms of not just the sectors of the business, but most important areas for them to address? Cost reduction, bridging the skills gap, digital disruption, not sure. And again, you have that no vote option there. But the reality is let's look at these and see the balance. Cost reduction seems to be getting the bigger play here, Mike.
I noticed that too, John, and I was thinking and looking at the possible responses that might be an unfortunate majority.
And this is an interesting point. And and I'm going to pose this question to everyone again. Why did you say cost reduction is the most important thing to CPOs? That's really the question that I want to gain from this. When you provide an answer, when you provide a vote, we're going to ask you to why did you provide it? I mean, this is a key part of all of us sharing and learning together in terms of what digital transformation actually means and what it involves. Now, Mike, as you look at these questions, you notice I haven't talked about anything about technology. Features, functions, wearable technology, gigabytes and zettabytes and all those things. You notice that I haven't done that, right?
I've noticed that your approach is a bit different, John, on this one.
So, is that an approach that sort of says that technology is irrelevant in this? Or do you think it places the importance of technology in proper perspective?
It definitely puts it in a different perspective and probably a more positive perspective.
Well, and you see, that's, I think, is the key, is that when you look at it and you think about digital transformation, we're trying to get the thought here is how do you prepare yourself individually? Remember, we're talking about putting the human side of this element into digital transformation of this discussion here. So when we look at it, what we want to be able to say is, okay, what are your thinking of this? And what I'm beginning to see here with everyone is that it's very much traditional in terms of the response. These are very much procurement answers that I would expect. Cost reduction. For example, why do you say cost reduction is so important? And is it the only important? Is bridging the skills gap going to be important? Is digital disruption going to be important? Now, if I look at this, Susan has said the company's driving cost reduction to meet KPIs. Robbie said with skills you will get cost reduction. Cost reductions are how procurement gets a seat at the table, that famous seat at the table. Kelly, thank you. If we can't understand savings, business folks will go around us. What do you mean go around us, Kelly? I mean, how do you do procurement without people? And how do they go around you? I'd like clarification on that there as well. Lisa said in the oil and gas industry there is a big push. I would imagine you're talking about cost reduction in that regard, Lisa. But again, please clarify. Digital procurement really is part of the value factor. I think that's an interesting perspective as well from Laura. So as we look at these, I guess it's safe to close the poll now. Cost reduction is by far the largest winner here, isn't it?
Yes, it is, John.
Okay, so here's the question I have for everyone, and why did you choose those particular or specific function? Why did you say cost reduction is by overwhelmingly the most important? I mean, that may seem like a dumb question to ask now, but why? If we look at it, and as we move to the next slide, we're going to talk about the fact that remains is that cost reduction is important. So you're not wrong. And by the way, there's no wrong answers here. In North America, and this is going to a Wall Street Journal 2017 study, 84% of responding CPOs cited cost reduction as their top priority. And it's also a top priority in other parts of the world. So, you have a right answer there. Yes, it is very, very important. And in fact, if we look at the progress of cost reduction, and here's a graph from that Wall Street Journal, we find that the vast majority, 58%, have actually found better savings than last year, where 30% have found the same level of savings. So you've got an overwhelming majority of 88% who have achieved the savings target or improved upon that. So now, here's an interesting point, Mike. Digital transformation hasn't taken full hold yet we're able to achieve these results. How much more do you think we could do with digital transformation when we start utilizing the new technologies to their full advantage? I mean, how do you improve on 88%?
That's very difficult, actually.
I mean, if you think about it, and I mean, this is an interesting thing. You've got a 12% gap. I mean, 10% said it was worse than last year. 2% no formal performance tracking. I don't know where that came in, but they've captured that particular statistic. But so 84% said it's very important. 88% are either doing the same or better, and the majority are doing much better. So CPO priorities certainly are in terms of savings. So where do we go from here? And I'm going to pose this to the audience. If savings are already being achieved at this particular level, can digital transformation actually make it any better? Can digital transformation actually improve capabilities? And in what way? And when you talk about savings, this is where I'm going to give you a hint. When you talk about savings and cost reduction, are you talking about savings relative to actual spend, or are you referring to savings in greater efficiency within the enterprise? That could be the answer there, right, Mike?
I think so, and I wonder if it would lead toward greater efficiency, John.
Well, I'll tell you, the key is, and you see, this is the gap and the promise. There's great promise, and I remember when the ERP solutions came out. I remember when the first computer came out. I don't want to date myself on that. And the spreadsheet, Zycus, and all the cycles it saved people and the time it saved. So what you ultimately did is you found new areas of saving. Cost reductions are something that can be achieved, but usually with cost reductions, and anyone out there who doesn't agree with me, please let me know, because we're not looking for consensus, we're looking for discussion, but there is a plateauing, if you will, of cost reductions or cost savings that you can achieve. Now, yes, you have to continually strive towards that, but the real question are these savings outside of digital technology? Where can you find more savings to justify or validate what you do from the procurement world outside of, again, achieving a higher savings performance? Have you thought of that? And that's really the key of the focus of what CPO priorities are looking at. We want to have cost savings. That never goes away. But here's a different thing. The skills gap. It comes back up again. And this goes with the survey. Talent drives procurement performance. Yet there is a large to moderate skills gap they're talking about, or a lack of skills needed to deliver the procurement strategies. Now, what does that mean? What strategies are they talking about delivering? If you're part of the 88% who are already either maintaining your level of savings or you're improving on those level of savings, where do you go? Why is there a skills gap in this regard? Is it because the skills gap is in terms of the new technology coming in? Will we get into a situation where what took 20 procurement people to do work now will be reduced to 10? And Mike, this adds another variable in this equation. Does digital transformation create jobs or threaten jobs? Isn't that an interesting question?
That's a very interesting question, John. As we get more efficient, do we need more people or less people?
Now, let me ask you this, and I'll pose this to the audience as well. Before this, Kathleen said it could be more throughput from digital options. Could be another one. Did you say VisiCalc? Man, are you on cutting edge. Thank you, Gregory. I appreciate that. That's a nice way to say I'm old, right? Anyway, different pool of talent. There's another factor that's coming into play. What about the up-and-coming generation? Are they going to be more comfortable and more equipped to handle digital transformation? I mean, how many of you out there, when you look at these things and respond to these polls, are saying, this is what I know, so I'm going to respond in this way? But how many are thinking, am I going to fit into the scheme of things going forward in this new digital world, in this new digital economy? Do I have the skills? Are the lack of skills indigenous to the current procurement professionals or the up-and-coming generation that's coming in. But you see, CPOs are very much concerned equally with the skills gap. If you look at it, 87% of respondents said that talent drives procurement performance. So now if we look at digital transformation, and remember, going back to our original discussion point, we're talking about the human side of digital transformation. We're talking about the key elements, the people elements to this, not the technology elements. I don't dissuade you from going out there and looking at the latest bells and whistles and the functionality that this digital transformation brings about, and certainly technological platforms. But having an understanding as to what's important from the CPO standpoint, from the organizational standpoint, and how to leverage technology and how that will have an impact, and where the skills gaps are in terms of what you have to do, that's in preparation for the digital economy. That's in preparation for digital transformation. So now you have a skills gap, but here's a paradox, and this is the thing that I don't understand. CPO priorities is that investment in new talent development remains low. In other words, in 2011, 5% of budget was spent, 5% of organizations 2011 had the commitment and dedication towards training. In 2016, 29%, and then 2017 it dropped 25%. Less than 1% of budget on training. So I have to raise this question. If training and the skills gap is so important, if CPOs and executives recognize that you need to have people who are able to do the job and utilize the technology, and they're saying it's a must to have, and they're certainly bemoaning to a certain degree the growing skills gap, then why aren't they investing more money in it? Can somebody answer that? Because you see, it would seem to be a contradiction. Now, one thing I pointed out earlier in the discussion in talking with the head of Microsoft Canada is that 54% of the jobs, only 54% of all, we'll call them new era jobs, are being filled. That means that 44% are still outstanding, but that gap is growing. In other words, there seems to be a rising or steadily growing demand for greater talent and greater capability to leverage technology, yet there isn't the support or the training or the education to help people to capitalize on that, to be able to take advantage of that. And so thus, you're going to see that number of 54% of the jobs being filled drop to 50, drop to 45. Where does that leave us in terms of the gap? And how can you have digital evolution, Mike, if you don't have the people to do it? It's like trying to say we've got the greatest car, but no one knows how to drive, right?
And, John, I think it's interesting, too, when you show those percentages that the interest is there of having trained people, but where do they think people will get trained if they don't support that?
Well, and that's the whole thing. You know, it reminds me of an old saying, Mike, when they used to say, what if we spend all this money to train people and they leave? And the response was, what if we don't and they stay? You know, think about that. I mean, the reality is there is a disconnect within the industry itself. And what kind of training are we talking about? What kind of training are we looking for? And that's really a key point. So while they prioritize, CPOs and executives in the industry prioritize training, recognizes the importance of people having the right skill set in terms of achieving their strategic objectives, there seems to be a continuing or a persistent lack of investment. And I guess what's interesting is from your standpoint, audience, what are the reasons? Do your organizations consider this important? Now Yvette asked, what are considered essential digital skills? Well, it just so happens we're going to be covering that in the next session. And I want to point that out and raise your question because we will be answering that. Digital skills, and this is another thought that comes to mind. Are we talking about technological competency or capability? What do you think, Mike? What are digital skills? I mean, I just learned to program my VHS VCR machine, so I think I'm very talented and adept. But the reality is what do you think digital skills entails? What do you think they include? And the rest of the audience, Yvette's question about what is essential digital skills, and I'll get into them in a moment, but what do you think digital skills involve? And what kind of training do you think you need to be able to acquire that capability? Now, Hugh said it's a contradiction. I believe they don't see education and training having a priority. And obviously the numbers bear you out right, Hoy, but the reality is that they're saying it's important. So, like, how do you say it's important but not invest? So how do they expect you to pick up the knowledge to compete? And that's one thing in a corporation and organization. And in past webinars, Mike, we talked about the fact is is that sometimes as procurement professionals, you have to take a step back and assess your organizational culture or values. Remember I talked about the head of Lenovo saying that we look beyond the technology to see if the culture could adapt and change. That was our digital transformation that began in 2005, long before all of this talk surfaced in recent years. But if you look at it, I mean, like, what exactly does it involve? What does it entail, and why won't the organizations make those investments? So it's like they don't see education as having training as having a priority. Why is that, and what can you do about it? You know, if you look at your organization and there is a digital transformation, a digital evolution coming, and you're not getting the support to do that, you have to assess what direction your company is going in. I'm not saying people have to quit, Mike. I'm saying is that if you're looking at not progressing any further, then maybe you look at the fact is it time for a cultural change? Because culture is as much a part of this digital revolution as is the technology, and that's the point I want to stress. Now Kelly comes back and indicates that because many senior leaders do not understand what procurement is, so they don't know how to invest in it. So what you're saying is, Kelly, is the captains of the ship really don't understand what you do, and so how can you invest in something and improving something if you don't put it in? So let's go back to that previous section though, where it said that 88% of the organizations either maintain their level of savings, or 58% of those 88 improve them. So is that more because of if it ain't broke, why fix it kind of approach or kind of mentality? Because let's face it, those are impressive numbers. If I'm getting 80 and 90 on my test scores, how important is that other 10%? But so you have to look at that and saying, is it a fact is it isn't broken? Yet again, it goes to the contradiction of this whole situation. Everyone's talking digital evolution. Everyone's talking about digital transformation, and organizations are recognizing the importance of that. And we're going to cover that momentarily. But do they really understand it? So when we talk about being digital ready, again, at the top, I talked about not only us from a procurement individual professional standpoint, but also from an organizational standpoint, because you have to choose the right organization with whom to work to become digital ready. Because if the culture isn't conducive to that, where is that going to lead? Now, Sergio said, adapt to a new negotiation modes. Now, that's an interesting one. That comes out of an area that I didn't think. Sergio, explain how digital transformation, how technology can improve negotiation, and how do you classify negotiation? Because there are platforms that help you to negotiate and manage contracts, but how do you see digital helping you to do that better? How does it change it from what you're doing now? Laura totally agrees with Kelly. Senior leaders, obviously, Laura, do not see it as being a value. Jerome says digital skills equals the ability to learn and to utilize new platforms to more efficiently run the organization. I like that. That should be a tagline for digital transformation, Jerome. But I mean, it's the ability to learn and utilize new platforms to more efficiently run the organization. In what areas can the organization run more efficiently? And Mike, that goes to the discussion we had moments ago, not that long ago, is that savings have traditionally been in the procurement world, cutting costs or negotiating the best price. Perhaps that's along the line of what Sergio's thinking, and getting better deals. But when we go into a new era of transformation and we leverage technology differently, we work more efficiently and we have better processes, which means savings come in the form of less resources needed to fulfill the same functionality. You know, a few years ago, Mike, I was speaking in an audience of 700. I'm surprised that I got out of there because the exit was at the back, and I was sure it was going to be pitchforks and torches when I read the results of a study that said that approximately 46% of all procurement professionals within the next 5 years will become redundant and unnecessary. Think about that. I must have been a popular guy that day, hey?
Oh, my goodness.
46% redundant. So, you know, if we look at this technology and we look at this, doesn't mean job loss necessarily. But, you know, I mean, that all goes to the fact is where are the savings going to come from? Is it better negotiation? What exactly does it entail? But going back to the point of this particular slide here, what we are talking about is that there is a talent gap, but there is a disconnect with the necessary investment to bridge that talent gap. And for whatever reason, and maybe I'll end with Kathleen here, is that training is great, but we need to think beyond classroom. And experiences are great learning opportunities, and we need to allow our employees to succeed and fall down to learn. So what Kathleen, you're basically saying is we got to move from the world and realms of theory of what can be accomplished to actually look at what can be achieved in a very practical, real-world sense. And if I got it wrong, please tell me. If I got it right, let me know as well. Now, when we look at CPO priorities, let's go to this question of digital disruption. 90% of global respondents, this is that Chief Procurement Wall Street Journal digital transformation survey, 90% of global respondents believe that their industries will be disrupted by digital technology. Only 44% are adequately preparing for these disruptions. It's almost like risk management, and you all in procurement will know this. Risk management is one of those things, and I'll cite a study going back to 2007 with Aberdeen that hasn't changed, and I had a panel discussion on this with risk, is that the reality is that when you look at risk, organizations say, yes, I recognize it as a very real problem, but the majority have done very little to actually address the risk potential. And in fact, many say it's almost like you got to wait till there's a problem before you can react to it rather than proactively being embraced. I'm looking at digital disruption, according to this, as being the same as risk management. And this raises the question, if in all this past decade, risk management, which we've seen manifest itself, especially in a global supply chain, a global economy that we're in now, manifests itself in so many serious and significant ways. If we haven't learned to manage risk better, how can we learn to manage digital disruption better? How can we adapt to digital transformation? You see, and these are the questions, and the point that I want to make here today is that the reality is that digital transformation, again, does involve technology, but it goes back to the rudimentary questions that have always existed within the procurement world. I'm sure it extends to other areas, Mike, but within the procurement world. And that is, we've got to answer those questions of training, of capability, of being able to respond to potential threats on the horizon or potential risk. And I think that's where the greatest weakness in all of this comes in, or perhaps the greatest obstacle to realizing those results, is that there is a slowness in terms of being able to respond to that and say, you know what, we know it's there, 90% agree it is, which was the highest percentage out of all the poll respondents for any one answer, and that includes cost savings, and that includes the talent gap, yet 44% are adequately preparing, only 44%. So I'm going to pose this question to the audience, because we're on this journey together. Why do you believe that there is such a discrepancy between those who acknowledge that it's going to be a disruptive force and only 44% adequately preparing for these disruptions? Why do you believe that? Why do you believe your organization may not be responding or laying down the groundwork to be able to utilize digital transformation to the way they should? And, you know, one thing that I want to point out here, and maybe, Laura, this was in a previous answer, but could be here, the fear of change is possibly a roadblock in digital readiness. Fear of change. People don't want to change, but you know, it's kind of interesting. If you look at that, I'm having trouble being able to grasp why organizations recognize the problem, but it's that fear of change. You raise a good point, because Lenovo's president said the same thing. Lenovo said, and it was important and poignant moment, and this is a high-tech, this is a technology company. They make computers, they manufacture technology, who's looking to go out to the edge of the cloud and beyond. They said because change is a difficult process within any organization. And that's why you have to do a cultural check. That's why you have to look at your organization and say, are you ready to embrace a digital transformation strategy? You can see it coming, but preparing for it involves an element of courage to be able to step out from the familiar and the comfortable to say, okay, what does this mean and how is it going to change things? So, Laura, I mean, your response there sort of covers and goes into the whole area we're talking about in terms of digital transformation. Now, let's look a few more. I think many are struggling how to prepare themselves for digital change. Kathleen says that. Culture is that you deal. Okay, this is interesting. Kathy, culture is that you deal with it and the fallout of disruptions as part of the norm. That's an interesting way to put it, isn't it, Mike? I mean, what does it mean to deal with it and the fallout of disruptions is part of the norm? Do you think that's suggesting, Kathy's saying, is that with any change or move to address digital disruption, that organizations are going to realize that there's going to be a hiccup and there's going to be challenges and bumps in the road, and it's the anticipation of those bumps that may be holding them back? What do you think?
I think it is those challenges, John, that you just mentioned and that Kathy alluded to that sometimes can make people hesitant to make that change.
Okay. Now, Kathleen adds to this. I think many are struggling with how to prepare themselves for digital change. Kathleen, I'm going to pose the question with you. How would you prepare yourself? If it was up to you and you were ahead of the strategy of digital transformation within your organization, what are the steps you would take to ensure that you're adequately preparing for the disruptions that are inevitably going to happen? Because Jerome came back and said, most organizations, I assume, Jerome, are in a reactionary stance. And you're probably right. We'll wait till it happens, and then we'll react to it. But by then it might be too late, or by then you may have experienced significant loss of traction or competitive edge in the marketplace. So, but Kathleen, what steps do you believe have to be taken to be able to do that? Now, Matthew, and I want to make sure I get some of the people coming in because we're going to have a lot of new people responding here. Overall cost reduction strategy, senior management out of touch with organizational operations. So, Matthew, is that frustrating? And does that put us as procurement professionals at a great disadvantage? If our organizations are not culturally ready to adapt digital transformation, if they're not positioning us to be able to move and transition, are they the authors of this skills gap that they're talking about and that they're saying we got to be able to address? I mean, is it sort of a self-inflicted lack of talent because they're not investing in it? I'd like to get a further comment from you on that, Matthew. Susan, management changes too often, which can hold back overall progress. First thing that I read that, Susan, I thought of good to great and the doom loop and the flywheel concept. And Mike, you've read Good to Great by Jim Collins, right?
I have, in fact.
And I actually have an autographed copy of a book from him, but that's another story. But management changes. They talk about the doom loop. And going back to the reactionary stance that Jerome referred to, when it comes to anything, it doesn't just have to be digital transformation. The mindset is that if we react, we try to do something in response to that reaction. We don't implement it properly. Thus, we can't get traction. When we can't get traction, we don't get buy-in. When we don't get buy-in, we're back at square one. And that's the significant problem here. Whereas the flywheel concept looks at it and says, look, there's a change coming. Let's gradually look at a way to make that progression to a new digital reality. And again, it applies in all areas of business. And this is the point I want to make of this whole session, going back to the comment and going back to the original discussion point. When we talk about digital transformation, everybody is talking about features, functions, and benefits and technology and what one technology can do over the next. And yes, technology is very, very important. You need to have a reliable platform. You need to have a technological platform that enables you to accomplish all that you can and to maximize your capabilities. However, without people, without the culture, that technology will not succeed. You need that ability to do it. So when you look back, Susan, you say management changes too often, that's an organizational problem. That's a cultural problem. And that should be a warning sign to you because you're then on that ship which is rudderless. And again, I'm not trying to encourage people, Mike, and I don't want to get anybody saying, I quit my job tomorrow because I listened to this webinar. But you have to ask these questions because you're part of this transformation process. And how is your organization going to help you to prepare individually? But going back, this is all digital transformation. As much as technology is important, it's still about people. And as soon as you realize that, you're able to understand where the key areas are. So digital disruption is recognized as being important. Now, what is digital transformation? And I'm just going to spend a second on this one. When you download this PowerPoint and you review this on the on-demand basis or you share it, yes, you can look at customer needs, you can look at digital disruptions, but do you see the big red wheel or gear in the right side? What does that say, Mike?
Digital enablers.
And what is the arrow that's pointing to the digital enablers wheel say?
Culture shifts, John.
And that is the heart of digital transformation. Culture shifts. Whether you're going from a reactionary stance, whether you're going from management who isn't investing in education, whether they're out of step, whether they're transitioning, the fact remains is digital transformation starts, relies on, and the outcome depends completely upon the cultural shift of your organization being digitally ready. Now let's go to the next one, and I just want to cover this. 65% of Global's CPO survey, and I love these surveys, and I provided the link here that you can access, say that analytics will have the most impact on the function in the next 2 years. Analytics. Now, this maybe is where it comes in terms of the technological side of the equation, the intelligence that you gain. And, Mike, I remember the old days of ERP technology platforms and the procurement people going into the world and saying, okay, we need intelligence, we need reports out of the old ERP platforms, and you'd have to line up behind other departments. And by the time you got your information, it was already 3 to 4 months old or outdated and, quite frankly, not very useful. Well, we have the technology to provide the information capability. How will digital transformation improve the analytics? How will it make analytics and the information not only available faster, but make it more usable in a very real and practical way? I mean, that's the real question that comes in here, and that's what CPOs are looking at in digital disruption. We don't just need information. We need to be able to have that information and be provided with the tools that enable us to analyze it and predict it. We're talking about predictive procurement, predictive analytics. We need to be able to bridge the gap between what is known and what isn't known, the uncertainty when we go into new relationships, because we're dealing in a global economy, we're dealing with global supply chains, where as it gets more extended, the amount of risk, the amount of uncertainty increases dramatically. And so that was one of the things about digital disruption that I found very, very interesting in here. Now, just a couple of notes here. Analytics is huge, Kathleen says, but you can get intoxicated with data if you don't focus on what you really want to get from it. How many agree with Kathleen? In other words, you can be what was the word you used? Intoxicated. I've never heard that for data. But nonetheless, you can get lost in terms of all the information that's available. But that comes to the ability to be able to sift through it, to sort through it, and that's what I was talking about in terms of having a practical, real-time ability to apply it. So now, let me just jump to the next one. This is another interesting part of this. Deployment of automation and robotics within their function will steadily increase. They're saying 50% right now will make some use or do make some use of these technologies. All of you out there, have you used robotics in your organization? What impact has it had on you from a procurement standpoint? But they're saying by 2025, 93% will move into these areas. And again, we're talking about, the utilization of the new technologies, the automation and robotics within the function itself. Now, do you see that as a benefit or a threat to you? And that goes down to another thing of resistance to adoptions. You know, Mike, we talked about companies not being proactive in terms of providing procurement professionals with the tools they need and the education they need to leverage and make the transition to a digital world. But would somebody be concerned that, and we go back to that example, is with greater technological capability? I mean, I've read articles saying, will robotics replace jobs? And to what degree will they replace? What impact will it have on procurement professionals? What are your thoughts out there in terms of, well, will this be a good thing or bad thing for procurement professionals? Will the skills gap diminish or decrease, not based upon the fact that we've educated more people, but we require less people? I mean, that's another question, Mike. I think that's an interesting question.
I think it is too, John, and it also, I think, points back to a thought you had a while ago earlier in the presentation about culture of the company you work for.
Absolutely, and you see, that's an interesting point. And, you know, Jerome, I'm going to add to what you just said, Mike, benefit, he's sure about that, it's only a threat to those who resist it. That's kind of interesting, Jerome. Is what you're saying is you've got to be able to embrace it and adapt to it. Otherwise, you'll be left behind. I mean, that's, I think, what you're saying, Jerome. If I've got that right, assessed what you said properly, let me know. Maybe. Okay. Jane, another new contributor to this discussion, the tactical level may decrease, but I don't believe the strategic level will. Okay, I got to ask you, when you talk about tactical versus strategic in relation to our session today, can you elaborate a little bit more, Jane, on what you mean by that? I'd like to get your perspective. I mean, I have an idea of what you're saying, but I'd like to hear from you as to what you mean. Edward, robotic will replace certain jobs, but will also require high-skilled employees to perform programming of the robots. Now, Edward, I think you're absolutely right with regards to that. I think what happens, but it goes to our question is that it will replace jobs, but the people who stay will have to have a higher skill level, and they'll bring it back to what Jerome said. It's a benefit. Only those who are threatened by it will not be able to adapt to it. And this goes back, Mike, to the whole point of the discussion of the human aspect of digital transformation. Again, you've got to look beyond the technology and see where do I fit into this equation. All these polls that we've done to this point in time show that, even with digital transformation, in the concept of digital transformation, the same old, and I don't mean old by being bad, I mean the same old or familiar, maybe that'd be a better word, familiar metrics for measuring performance and success haven't changed. They're all the same. In fact, I could put up those slide results. I could put up the slides that I put up today 5-10 years ago, and you'd probably have the same responses. We want to drive costs down. We want to be able to have greater efficiencies. All of these things have not changed. And that's what's interesting about all of this. And, Mike, that's why people have to look beyond the technology. It's easy to get lost in it. But, I like to liken it to when fax machines came out, or when computers started coming out. And I think I said this at the very beginning. They revolutionized the way we did things. But did they really change our objectives? To what degree did they change our objectives, or was it more an impact on the processes and how we go about achieving them? You know what I'm saying, Mike?
I think it was much more on the process, John, just the way that we went about doing what we were doing.
There you go. Now, Jane has filled in saying purchasing of low-level product or items would be tactical. So you're talking about, again, you're talking about ORM-type products. There's not a lot in terms of complexity. They're commodity items. I mean, that's really what you're talking about. That's what you're referring to as tactical, right, Jane? And the strategic ones are the more complex procurements and purchases. Now, it'd be interesting to see how the digital revolution will affect either of those areas. For example, how would this digital transformation make low-level product purchasing more efficient and more beneficial? Keeping in mind that the objectives and the goals are still the same. And by the way, I hope there's comfort in that. What I just talked about a minute ago is that the goals and the objectives are still the same: to drive cost savings, to be able to create greater efficiencies. All of these things, it's just the technologies that's changing. And so what you're looking at, Jane, and what I'm trying to extract from you in terms of this is knowing that and saying, okay, tactical are the low-level product or items. Now when you look at digital transformation, how do you think of it in those terms? And that's really the key part of it. Now, I think we're going to be running out of time soon, aren't we, Mike?
We have about 9 minutes or so, John.
Okay, so I better talk faster and click faster. Okay, so hang on a second, because I want to get to the next poll. So, somebody said, what are the key capabilities? Because we're having all these discussions about digital transformation. We're talking about, the impact, the training, what CPOs consider important. And even though digital is important, it still hasn't replaced the traditional areas of focus, but certainly there should be a greater balance in terms of your view of them. Now, what are we looking at in terms of key capabilities? Well, here's the poll question, and this is our final poll. Which of the following activities demonstrates a high-performance procurement practice? Is it strategic business and supplier collaboration activities? Is it M&A to corporate risk planning? Or is it new product or service development or other? And then we can cue the Jeopardy music. That's what we forgot today, the Jeopardy music.
We did, John. I apologize for that.
Well, and by the way, do you know what the title of that theme is?
I don't.
You see, I do, which tells you I have far too much time on my hands. Merv Griffin wrote the song for his son, Something for Timmy. That's the name of the tune.
Wow.
So there you go. There's data that, there's, of course, 20 seconds of your life you'll never get back, and I don't know what you'll do with that, but it was just an interesting sidetrack. So we're looking at this in strategic business and supplier collaboration activities. Now, you see, you go back here in terms of what's important and what's key here. Collaboration, strategic business, M&A. I find this interesting, M&A to corporate risk planning and new product service development. I just want to say one thing, and I'm not going to influence anyone's vote here, but about 6 months or 9 months ago, I'm talking with senior executives in the industry, and particularly as it relates to, just business in general, but also what's happening on the side of the service providers in our industry, is we're entering a new era of mergers and acquisitions that are happening. I think there isn't a week or two that goes by where there isn't another acquisition that's happening in our industry and certainly in industries in general. So we're looking at a great deal of flux happening, and what's interesting is M&A and corporate risk planning is such an important element that we can't ignore that. I think that is a key area. It is what makes us strategic. It isn't just being strategic within our own realm of the familiar, but M&A to corporate risk planning, I think, is incredibly important for us to be aware, because we're no longer hard partitioned. I guess that's a great term, a good term, hard partition into our traditional functional lines. There are going to be increasing overlap. So as you look at each one of these areas, think a little bit about, well, I might want to expand my parameters of thought. Now, I understand some of you will come back and say, well, that's not in my job description, and I understand that. But depending on the organizations you're dealing with and getting that coveted seat at the table, a greater perspective, not just from a procurement standpoint, but a more holistic overall organizational perspective can only help you. So, Mike, do you think we're closed off here? Do you think we've got enough of an answer?
I think most of the sites have made their final responses, John.
All right. So now let me just look at this here. In terms of the site, we've got 91% strategic business, M&A. Okay, so heavily lean towards that. And again, I'm going to pose this question to everybody else who responded. Why is strategic business and supplier collaboration activities important? And I'm just clicking on my screen here. It's moving a little bit slow, so I can't get to that next slide. There you go. All right. Why is that important? Now, Jerome, you said all of the above are important. I think I assume you're referencing the particular areas that we covered in there. Well, let's look at high performance procurement, and again, citing the Wall Street Journal study. For most companies who improve in the 7 capabilities, and they're talking about tough choices remain and new ways of generating productivity will need to be found. Now, Mike, that last line goes to what we've been talking about a little bit earlier on, where we said, it's not savings now in relation to driving down cost of products or the actual procurements itself, but this speaks to the fact that there's got to be greater efficiencies in terms of where we can add value, and productivity itself is being redefined in our industry. So it's really important to be able to broaden your perspective on what exactly is productivity in my company. What does it look like? Now, 7 capabilities. Just a quick question, everyone. Have you ever heard of the 7 capabilities? Pause for a moment. I'll probably give you an answer in terms of this, but there are actually 7 areas cited by chief procurement officers that are important talents that procurement professionals must have. It includes executive advocacy, stakeholder alignment, you can read these as well, decision-making, talent strategy, talent investment, talent capability, and lo and behold, digital procurement. Now, I want to see that. Digital procurement is in there, but look at all these other characteristics. I mean, Mike, I think it would be safe to say that 6 out of the 7 have very little to do, maybe in some direct way, but very little to do with the digital transformation that all of us are going through. And remember, this is a study from 2017, so this isn't old. So, if you look at that, digital procurement is there, but how many of those other capabilities would be required or valued outside of technology? What do you think, Mike?
John, that's a really interesting list of 7, and as you said, it would appear, at least on the surface, that only the final one really points in this direction.
And you see, and that's it. And that's an important direction, to be certain. But if you look at that, how many of you listening right now, looking at this, are saying, wait a second, what's executive advocacy, and what does that have to do with my job? Now, somebody had said stakeholder alignment, and I want to look here. Is it Sergio, to align supply chains and avoid supply chain disruptions? It's interesting, Sergio, that you say that, because you got a little bit of not only strategic alignment, but you got a little bit of risk management in there. And I think that's key, is supply chain disruptions, especially as become more extended globally, become a key element. Now, I'll pose this to you, Sergio. In regards to this, how can digital procurement help you to better align supply chains and avoid supply disruptions? Kathy, more along the lines of a maturity model for procurement. Now, there's an interesting thing, Kathy. When you talk about a maturity model, to what are you referring specifically? In terms of the maturity of the organization, are you talking about it from a cultural standpoint? Are you talking about it from a skill set standpoint? Are you talking about it from a technological standpoint? In what area are you referring? But I would tell you, and again, I provide you the link to this Wall Street Journal article, but looking at all of these, how many of these do you currently possess in the way of talents? Kathy says applications and results. Neja says, how could I PDF formatted this presentation? Mike, that sounds like a question for you, but we'll share that at the end of this. But look at these 7 skills. and look at what you're doing right now. If you want to become digital ready, where do you line up on these skill sets? The survey indicates that executive support for procurement, and this is the key now, and this is the point, it's never been stronger, notwithstanding the lack of investment in training, but the functions have increased as well. So you're in a position now as a procurement professional during a time of digital transformation to begin to not only step onto the main stage under the spotlight, but to have to deal with the scrutiny of that spotlight and getting measured on performance. And the traditional measurements, while important, are not the only measurements. And so when you look at digital transformation, I want you to look at it from the concept of how the technology as an extension of what you do can be leveraged to deliver greater value in areas that you've never even considered possible before or viable before. Now, Mike is answering. I want to see what this. I'm moving down here. I'll check to see if the slides. Okay, thank you, Mike. That's you, Mike. Sorry.
Yes, sir.
Now, let's see. Supplier profile analysis, risk review capabilities are based on scanning the internet to alert and report risks associated with suppliers. And there's emerging technologies that are coming up to being able to do that, which is certainly part of digital transformation. But again, the whole point of today's session isn't to talk about the technology from the standpoint of individual function. It's to talk about really that the next move is your move. And I think that's the best way to put it, is that when you look at digital transformation and realize that technology advancement is inevitable, 20 years from now, we're going to be talking about another amazing breakthrough. Just like we did 20 years ago with the advent of PCs, which many in the IT department 20, 30 years ago said was a passing fad, which of course it isn't. You've got to be able to look, when you look at digital transformation, beyond the forest to see the trees, or you can't see the trees for the forest. Yeah, that's about right. To be able to see the trees of what is practically required and what organizations are looking for and how those needs or requirements are changing. That's really the key about digital transformation from the human side of things. Mike, I think we're probably out of time, right?
We're right near the very top of the hour, John, but I'll certainly turn things over to you if you saw any additional questions you'd like to respond to, or perhaps for sure any closing comments you might have before we wrap things up today.
Well, I think I've said what I could relative to all of this. I'll leave the floor open for the next couple of minutes to you. What are your thoughts in terms of digital transformation? How can you take what you saw today, and how does it make you view digital transformation? Is it the way that you expect? And you can answer. It could be a rhetorical question if you want, but certainly the chat room is still open. Has it caused you to look at digital transformation in a different light? Was it along the lines of what you expected when you talk about digital transformation? Those are the things that I think are important to consider. At the end of the day, what I'd like you to be able to do is walk away from this saying, I see digital transformation beyond the technology, and I know what I have to do to leverage it, or at least I'm pointing in the right direction to know what I have to do to get the most out of the emerging technologies and have an impact, get the seat at the executive table, as one person said it, but have an impact on my organization. And I also have learned how to assess whether or not my organization is digitally ready, and is the culture within my organization conducive to helping me to excel and grow into this new reality that is the digital world. That's the way I'd like to close it, Mike, and I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, very well. And John, perhaps just for a moment or two, we'll call out one more time for any last additional questions or any last additional comments you'd like to make through the Q&A panel. Looks like maybe there might be something there, John, if you'd like to make any comment on that before we wrap things up.
We'll close with Matthew, and thank you for this, Matthew. Digital transformation is needed for the future of procurement and supply chain. It will allow automation, reporting efficiencies, and a stronger strategic workforce. Maybe that's a way to look at it, is again, within the context of what it can do to help in these particular areas. So I think we'll leave it at there, Mike.
All right, John, well, thanks again for a terrific presentation and the opportunity to work with you again today. So at this point, on behalf of the Institute for Supply Management and Zycus, we would like to thank you for your participation in today's event. This will conclude our program for today. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.